All right, welcome back to House Rules, a podcast by the Utah House of Representatives. I'm Representative Candice Pierucci. I represent Harriman and Riverton in the Utah legislature. And since I've gotten into this position and been elected, homelessness has been the issue we are constantly talking about and trying to address. It's one of the toughest issues, most multifaceted issues facing our state. It touches mental health, addiction, public safety, and housing all at once. And there's no single fix for it, we've learned. So the White House's executive order on homelessness this year made the case that leaving people on the streets isn't compassionate, which is something I've heard you say, Tyler, many times. It's not compassionate to the homeless individuals. It's not compassionate to the communities around them. And Utah's really been working on this problem from a lot of different angles. And today we've got some good news to talk about. I'm joined by Tyler Clancy, who left the House of Representatives, who was the youngest individual elected to the House of Representatives in our body. And he left in March to take on this new role as Utah's state homelessness director to try and tackle this issue for us, to come from the legislative body to go to the executive branch. And we miss you, but we're so grateful to have you working on this. So Tyler, thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And definitely miss working with everyone every day. But we're always here to help, and we're working hard at the Office of Homeless Services.
Absolutely. They're lucky to have you there. So Tyler, last year, the numbers were, we were up 18% for our point in time count in terms of individuals experiencing homelessness. But this year we have some good news. We're down 2%, which is great to hear. So when you're looking at these numbers, what does it show? Where are we at today?
Yeah, I think it shows that we're making progress. You talked about kind of our guiding principles, right? That we don't believe it's compassionate to leave people in these terrible situations. And so we want to build the capacity, but also the systems to help people. So what we're seeing this year was actually a little interesting. We had one of the warmest winters on record, and we saw some declining numbers, some early numbers of declining homelessness. You would think that in a warmer winter, there's going to be more people outside just based on human nature. And so it's a lot of work still to be done, but we're trending in the right direction.
Amazing. So it looks like, unsheltered homelessness fell nearly 10%. Chronic homelessness fell almost 7%. It's worth noting that the Code Blue emergency shelter nights fell 43%. So to your point on it being a warmer winter, but the decline is happening. It's not just some fluke or more shelter beds opening that skewed the count. But as you said, we do have more work to do. And I know that that's something you're really excited about working on. But let's jump back really quick to the White House, President Trump putting out an executive order on homelessness and street disorder. It was signed July 2025, and it's aimed at, addressing this issue and also public disorder together, not treating them as separate issues, but really bringing back the concept of public safety and this balance here. How does this match up with what we're doing here in Utah?
Definitely. Well, I would say in Utah, we were ahead of the curve. We had tackled some of these hard issues in years past. And so when the executive order came out that asked states to align with this, we were already ahead. And so I think we're going to be well slated to work with our federal partners. What you just described is exactly what we're working on. Homelessness is one word that describes thousands of different Utahns facing thousands of different challenges. And so one challenge that really presents itself quite acutely is what we would describe as disorder. And so you have individuals who are caught in a cycle of addiction, maybe untreated mental health, and they're cycling through the criminal justice system. These are the folks that maybe they're screaming at a UTA stop. They're getting arrested 4, 5, 6 times within 6 months. These are the folks that what law enforcement would call frequent flyers, or if we've described it as high utilizers in the system. And so we believe by being granular and being precise about what interventions we're going to bring to bear, we think that we can help people heal and help communities ensure that safety is there as well.
Amazing. So this is something you now live and breathe in as homeless coordinator, homeless director, right, for the state of Utah. But explain for our listeners. So there's this idea of housing first policy that we're shifting away from. Or walk us through that, what that means, housing first, because we hear that a lot. And it sounds really catchy, Tyler. It sounds great, housing first. But walk us through that and why that wasn't working and why this new approach in tackling it you think will have better results.
Absolutely. It's a good question. Housing first started as a philosophy. So it's kind of an idea that makes a lot of sense to all of us, which is, so once again, let's talk about that gentleman who's at the UTA bus stop, screaming to himself and in caught in that cycle. And maybe there's untreated mental illness. Maybe there's some addiction involved. Well, the philosophy of Housing First would say, let's get that person inside, and then we can address all those different challenges. I think everyone can kind of nod their head and say, that generally makes sense, whether that's a shelter or housing. But what that morphed into, particularly under the President Obama's administration and President Biden's administration, is it morphed into an extremely prescriptive rule set. And it actually prohibited folks who take funding from HUD, so that federal homelessness dollars, it prohibited them from doing anything other than putting a roof over someone's head. So you can think, take a program where folks are dealing with behavioral health challenges. A program that said, as a part of coming into our shelter, you have to come every night at 6 p.m. and do a class with our groups. That would be prohibited under Housing First. Religious shelters, they were defunded under Housing First. And so it grew as a really well-intentioned philosophy to a rulemaking regime that squashed a lot of innovation and different pieces of the puzzle. So you said the last thing I'd say on that is you said, why didn't Housing First work? I actually think Housing First does work for some people. But what Housing First, the capital H, capital F Housing First, the rules is it said that's the only intervention that we can do. It's the only solution to a multifaceted problem. That we know from Utah, where we really believe in local solutions, was not working.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you explaining it. I think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where you have to have in the pyramid, the basic necessities met. But if someone has serious addiction issues or coupled that with a mental health disorder, putting them in a house or in a shelter isn't going to make all that go away. And so I love that you're actually looking at the root causes of the problem and not just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom. You're actually trying to fix it. And it sounds like this new administration we have is also in alignment with this new approach. And hopefully we see that the national level is now going to be rewarding this new model that we have in Utah that has accountability paired with treatment and not just shelter alone. So I think that that's really important. But I know you coming in as director, you came with a game plan. You had 3 pillars that you presented, and I want to give you a chance to talk about it because we got to see a little bit of an EAC during interim. But I think it's important for our listeners to understand what's the state's plan moving forward, specifically accountability for high utilizers, emergency shelters looking forward in that mental and behavioral health capacity.
Absolutely. Well, you nailed it, right? The pillars really came out of discussions with the legislature, folks who are boots on the ground, people like Chief Red from Salt Lake City Police Department, and the governor's office, who Governor Cox has made this a huge priority in the budget and in policy. And so that's where I think we saw that synergy where everyone was firing on the same cylinders. So what are those 3 pillars? The 3 pillars is essentially our pronged strategy to address this broad problem that we call homelessness. So we'll start where you shared mental health. When you have someone who has a severe and persistent mental illness, so much so to the point that they might not even recognize their own name. They might not recognize in the winter, maybe they're out in the freezing cold wearing their underwear. This is not a choice. This is someone's mental health that has deteriorated, that this is a healthcare condition. So what we're saying is that we need to build the right capacity for the folks who need that type of healthcare. We've done really, really good as a country and as a state getting mental health care. If you or I were in a tough situation, we could pick up the phone and say, I need to talk to a therapist. And we're going to right the ship. We're going to rely on family and friends to kind of buoy us up. But folks that have a severe and persistent mental illness, think of untreated schizophrenia, or what is called as agnoxinosia, where you don't recognize you have a mental illness. You're not going to raise your hand and say, I need help, because you don't recognize it. We want to make sure that every single Utahn who's experiencing a mental health challenge has the capacity that they can get the help they need. And so what we see on the streets, and this is kind of what we were alluding to earlier, particularly in our unsheltered homelessness, we see a larger proportion of those individuals dealing with that untreated mental illness. So Utah has a great laws on the books about civil commitment and mental health treatment. We need to build the capacities, which is what the legislature invested in this year, to bring up some of these boarding homes where people have 24/7 access to medication and clinicians on site, along with other interventions and building that treatment necessary to get people on a better path of healing.
Absolutely. I had a chance to go on a ride along with Chief Red after he shifted over with Salt Lake City. And two thoughts on what you just shared. One was we went to a park. There was a group of people there. Clearly, there were several individuals who were experiencing some level of mental illness or some disorder, and then others who there were some addiction issues. But as I sat down and talked to them, what was so sad to me was like this lack of hope. And I kept thinking of my own family members, and I was trying to connect with them and ask about their family, and just very much felt like, had not a few things happened in my life, anyone could be in their spot, right? But the other thing that was concerning was in another shift over from the park, there was someone who, it was like a hit and run, and we went over, and that person they had just picked up like a week before. The officer was like, "We know this guy. He's kind of a frequent flyer here." Talk to us about those high utilizers and how we're going to address that in the system, because that is such a drain on our resources in terms of morale. And you know this better than anyone, being an officer, like that you're constantly rearresting people and who you're like, man, I just picked up this person yesterday. So like, how do we fix that problem? Because I think for law-abiding citizens, it's really frustrating to feel like there is two tiers of accountability there.
Right. And I think what you're hitting on is what we've described as high utilizers, which is we've defined it, and we're going to continue to work with the legislature and the governor's office to get a universal definition. But for just us leading out and trying to put a name to the problem, described as individuals who had 4 or more arrests within 1 year in 2025. And so in Salt Lake City, that number was over 700 people have been arrested 4 or more times
within a year.
Yep.
Okay.
So the total number, I think, was 1,021. When you look at that number, there was a percentage somewhere in the 70% range that were experiencing homelessness. So what are we seeing there? And then you can even go further and say there was about 200 to 300 people who had been arrested 12 or more times within 2025. Wow. And that's really the dynamic that you're describing, is this kind of catch and release piece.
Yeah.
I think what you're seeing is 2 things. One, someone that's caught in that behavioral challenge, a lot of times it's tied to drugs. A lot of times it's tied to what we would describe as disorder. So high frequency misdemeanor crime. Someone's in that cycle. They're really dealing with that behavioral health challenge. We're dropping them off at the front door of a homeless shelter and telling the shelter providers, good luck, figure it out.
Yeah.
When in reality, we're recognizing there's actually a higher level of intervention that's needed to get someone back on that pathway to healing. That's still going to include housing. It's still going to include, that employment and the different things that we work on. But there's some core, right? You said the root causes. There's some things here that need to change. And so what we're looking at, we've partnered with the Department of Corrections that this year we're going to be building and bringing online 180 beds for individuals who are caught in this cycle of the criminal justice system. So we're calling it Project Arch, which is accountability and reentry for homeless individuals. And this is saying, listen, you're on a 100-mile-an-hour path. There's 2 outcomes. Incarceration, right? You can only do it for so long before you are going to get sent to prison.
Right.
Or 2, death. The number 1 cause for homeless Utahns is a fatal drug overdose.
Yeah.
And so to slow down that path, we're saying we're going to give you a chance to get these charges off your record. We're going to give you a chance at a fresh start, but we're going to do it in a way that's actually a partnership, that there's accountability, because it's not fair to the citizens of the community that you're re-victimizing.
Yep.
And it's not fair to you as a fellow Utahn that we're not going to put an off switch there. And so this Arch program, we're hoping can make an impact on those individuals.
Amazing. And I think it's so critical that you identified that and that you're able to actually now find the right resources and solution to address those. Because if not, we're just running the same circle and spinning our wheels and spending a lot of money in the process. And I think, too, you hit on things like accountability. You have great programs like the Other Side Academy that provide really innovative, accountable structures that can be game-changing for people. Again, on this ride-along, while I was there was a nonprofit group that came in that was offering like a regular shot and like just some hygiene products. And I started talking to the gal volunteering with it, and she said, I was them like 5 years ago. And she said, were it not for me going to jail, were it not for me being incarcerated, I would be dead. And she felt like that was what was her critical moment, and that it was a gift that someone finally held her accountable, and it forced her to clean up her life. And now she's out helping these people, right? So I think to your point, if we want to be compassionate, we actually have to expect more here and be fine-tuned in our approach. So you've talked about, this ARCH program, which sounds incredible. You've talked a little about mental and behavioral health capacity. Talk a little about emergency shelters. I feel like that's something, again, that we hear mostly dollar signs when we hear emergency shelter in the legislature, but it's something we talk about quite a bit. So what are we doing there? We did have a warmer winter, but we're going into the hot season now. What does that look like moving forward?
Well, this is where we can share some good news. About 75% of all Utahns who enter the homeless services system will exit within a year. That's because of the programs. We actually don't call them homeless shelters in Utah. We call it a homeless resource center because when you walk through that front door, you're going to be met by all of these resources and case management. And so for folks who are down on their luck, experiencing economic hardship, my job at Burger King, I just can't pay the rent. That's a real thing. And so people might dip what we would describe as situationally into homelessness. They get the resources, maybe they get some housing assistance, they get back on their feet, and they're good to go.
Yeah.
So really what we're talking about when we talk about pillar 1 and pillar 3 is that 25% that have more chronic needs. And so we want to make sure that with those investments, and the legislature has made this possible, is to sustain those investments in shelter, housing, and the programs to get people back on their path to not just self-sufficiency, but to thriving, because that's the ultimate goal, right? You mentioned lived experience. When we talk to folks with lived experience on the other side of hardship, they'll tell you a couple of things. I wanted someone to not give up on me, keep pushing me. If I fail, keep pulling me along, right? Don't give up on me. When we talk to folks who are in the thick of it, they share different things. Leave me alone. Just give me a roof over my head and stop bothering me. So we want to listen to that lived experience of folks that this is what it took for me to get out of the ditch. And we think we can do that. We know we have a lot of progress. We know we have a lot of work to do, but we have the talent in Utah and the leaders in Utah to really get it done.
Absolutely. It feels like we're at this point in time where we're really going to be able to move the needle, and you're part of that. This session, we put money to back these 3 efforts. We believe in you and in these policies. So we put $45.6 million total investment, $19 million in ongoing, $26+ million in one time. As you mentioned, 75% of individuals who are accessing these crisis and emergency services, they're not returning to the system. And I think we forget that silver lining and that we are doing something right there. And we have an incredible system in Utah. And I would even argue just like our social capacity between our church infrastructure, and I use lowercase church of all the churches, Catholic Community Services, LDS Services, the synagogue, everyone coming together to say, it is our Christian duty to help these people. And that's happening. But then you also are seeing this nexus between those more complicated issues. You'd call it a wicked problem in public administration, right? Where you just can't quite crack that nut, that we're having to have this multi-pronged approach, which you just described. So appreciative of what you're doing. You're taking the same inspirational approach down in the legislature of this like fierce tenacity and determination to fix this. And I'm so excited to see where this goes. And honestly, it's going to be incredible to see people whose lives are changed. They're going to be able to come back and say thank you to you for pulling them out of the trench and being there for them. So really appreciate that. And thanks for coming on and breaking this issue down for us. Everyone listening, thanks. We've had a lot of great progress here, but we're not done and we're going to keep working on it. And thanks for tuning into House Rules. Just subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you around next time. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you, Representative.
You bet. Thank you.